Pilots, what's the scariest thing you've seen while flying? Navy carrier pilot here. My story is more about what I couldn't see. I joined a squadron on deployment near Guam for a couple months one time. It had been about 6 months since I had landed on a carrier, so I had to do a few day and night passes to get current again. My first night with them, the plan was for me to get 2 traps. We would come down as the first plane in the recovery, launch again, and come back and as the last plane in the recovery. Nothing crazy, we do it all the time to keep both pilots current. The only thing different is I would fly both passes. This night was overcast, so no moonlight made it though to the surface of the ocean, making it very dark when you descend through the clouds. It's also the middle of the ocean. It is so dark that you can't tell where the water ends and the sky starts. Not that it mattered though, because we were still in the clouds down at 1200 feet. As we are coming down first in the conga line of aircraft on 2-minute intervals, we hear paddles. The pilots on the back of the ship who help guide you down say 99. The deck is moving. This means that the flight deck is pitching, rolling, and or heaving with the ship's motion more than it usually does. This happens occasionally, and it's always a bit sketchy, but that's what paddles is there for. Anyway, as we are flying our needles down toward the ship, we pass 400 feet at about 1 mile, and we are still in the clouds in the dark. We get to the normal handoff point between the approach controller and paddles at 3/4 mile. Approach says show you on and on. 3/4 mile, call the bull. This is the point where we would look outside and confirm that we see the lights on the ship that guide you in on the correct glider slope. In carrier aviation, if you can't see the bull or you don't know where you are on glider slope for some reason, you say clara, meaning clarify my position, at least that's what I always assumed it stood for, and paddles will step in on the radio and give you some help. Well, in this case, we can't even see the ship, so we respond with clara ship. Paddles comes back with 601. Taxi light on. That means they can't see us either, and they need us to turn the taxi light on so they know where we are. We turn the taxi light on, and paddles says paddles contact, and continues to talk us down towards the deck. We are probably passing though 150 feet here. Eventually, we finally break out, and about 3 to 5 seconds later, we hit the deck and come to a stop. It was raining so hard we could barely see the taxi director on the deck. They taxi us to the bow catapults, and we shoot off into the darkness to do it again lol. Luckily, the weather cleared a bit, and the deck steadied a bit for the second pass. That still remains the craziest thing I have done in an airplane. A skydiver about 20 yards off my wing was flying a 172 into an uncontrolled field that I've flown into 100 times before, not knowing that after a 5-year ban in skydiving there, they were allowing it on a case-by-case request. While flying in, calling my position, I hear skydiver in the air. My first thought was I hope they aren't this direction, and then there he was. I had this image of him going through my prop. After that thought, oh god please, don't let me kill this guy. Then I turned to WTF just happened and how did the pilot not call this out better? He flew off completely. Come to find out the pilot was flying his friend to skydive to his local field, then departed to his home airport where they came from. I never did find the guy. My dad told me a story from a few years ago that happened while flying a 737 somewhere in Nevada, I think on the way back to Toronto. It was later in the evening, so you couldn't see too much, but all of a sudden to the left of the plane my dad saw a really bright ball of light, I guess you could say, moving really fast across the sky. My dad and his co-pilot had no clue what it was, and they could hear other pilots nearby calling it in over the radio and asking what it was. Eventually it flew past and disappeared into the distance. A few days later my dad found out that what he saw was a missile launched by a USN submarine. I wonder how many passengers thought they saw a UFO lol. My airfield where I did my pilot training had a waterway at the approach end of the runway, and oftentimes there were sailboats heading out to sea as you were coming into land. Usually came in a little high, since the runway was plenty long enough. One day, not long after I had completed my first solo, I was doing my run up, waiting for one of the regular pilots to land his low-wing sport airplane. He obviously didn't see the mast of the sailboat crossing, and he hit it. The plane cartwheeled down the runway and broke into pieces. I took my plane back to the tie-downs to clear the area and then went to help him out of the plane before it caught on fire, which it didn't. Amazingly enough, the pilot broke both of his hands at the wrists and fractured a whole bunch of stuff. Unfortunately, he was a surgeon. Not sure if he was able to work again. Needless to say, I was always very careful on approach after that. My dad is a former pilot. He once told me about how he almost crashed his Cessna because he hit some geese. He was actually preparing for a landing approach when he hit geese flying in a patch of fog. Windshield was completely shattered and he and his passenger were covered in blood and feathers. They landed safely, but my dad was pretty scarred from that. He didn't quit flying because of that, but bird strikes remained a constant fear of his. Geese are large birds, and they did significant damage to that little plane. This actually happened on my first time flying with no instructor on board. Just doing a couple laps around the traffic pattern. Took off. Laps #1 and #2 went just fine. Mailed a couple radio calls. Got that awesome feeling of yeah, I got this. But lap #3 was fine until I was setting up my final approach to land, and the GTN 750, basically a fancy navigation / radio / pseudo radar system, warned me about a Cessna 1 mile out at the same altitude. Ignored it, since I already had the plane in sight, and verified with a control tower that he was landing on the runway parallel to mine. Lo and behold, this dude zips under me by about 200 to 300 feet, which sounds like a good amount of room, but is actually butt-clenchingly close in a busy airspace like this. I shoulder applied full throttle and circled back around to try again, but the other plane was clear of me before the startle factor even wore off. This was made especially dangerous by the fact that the plane I was flying was low wing, can't see under me, and the other plane was high wing, he couldn't see above him. So, neither of us could see each other, and the tower yelled at the guy to get out of my way, and I landed safely. Not a pilot, but my daddy's. That said, we were flying out of Las Vegas, and upon takeoff we nearly collided with another aircraft. This other guy never radioed into tower, never mentioned anything about landing, just off in his own little world, as if he owned the air. He was in a twin-engine Beech. We were in a single prop Cessna. We were literally within 200 feet of each other, enough that we could see one another and could probably smell the we were crapping out, except their pilot, because that guy was so clueless he probably didn't even know there was a runway there. I wouldn't be surprised if he was trying to land on the actual Las Vegas Strip. Not a pilot, but this happened on a commercial flight, and we were never told what actually happened. The cabin started becoming visibly smoky and smelled strongly of smoke. I was in the window seat and the wall/window became hot to the touch. The scariest part was that the flight attendants were clearly panicking. They were running up and down the aisles frantically feeling all of the overhead bins for something on fire. They asked us repeatedly to check our devices to make sure nothing was overheating. People were having panic attacks and I started wondering what it would feel like to die/how it would happen. The pilot announced that we were close enough to the airport that we were going to continue about 15 to 20 minutes and have an emergency landing. When we landed, the runway was lined with fire trucks, ambulances and rescue vehicles. They didn't let us off of the plane for quite some time. Ultimately, firefighters boarded and ushered us off. They never told us what happened. I had to fly back, same airline. 2 days later, while checking my bags, the employee said, "OMG, you were on that flight. That was bad." He gave us a $15 in flight credit and told us to call the airline for more compensation. Never did, but I still wonder what happened. To borrow my late uncle's story, he confided to me, he had a 182 on floats and on several occasions was happy to play family airlines so that various relatives could make weddings and other events that were just too far for driving and overnighting. One trip was from home base, Vancouver to Kamloops in the interior. He flew VFR, and it was a pretty simple task to head out up the Fraser Valley until it pinched off at the town of Hope. At that point there is a notch in the wall of mountains through which the Coquihallabos River and Highway 5 goes. From there, following Highway 5 northeast brings you straight into Kamloops. Their destination that day, probably a 200-mile flight. The morning flight up went fine. The 3 passengers went to their event, and come afternoon's end, they headed back in what were supposed to be clear skies. Flying the reverse route, clouds began to form quickly on the forested sides of the valley, and soon rolled over the small plain. He was fairly confident of his heading, and stuck to it as the sky whited out. It was all he could do in a day without sat-nav equipment. If he was off by only a few degrees, they'd fly right into a mountainside. His passengers seemed to take no notice, engaged as they were in recounting the day's events. Trying to climb above the cloud was just as dangerous. Small single-engine Cessnas are not pressurized, and even if it topped at, say, 6,000 feet, the last thing he wanted was to pop out on top of what might be a white surface as far as the eye could see. If he could drop down once past Hope, there was a good chance of flying under the soup back to Vancouver. It was, he said, the only time he was really scared in his airplane. The miles ticked away. They should be nearing Hope. He never saw it. Suddenly the clouds scattered, and before him spread the valley under a high ceiling. He'd threaded the needle, and been right not to chance climbing. They landed at the South Airport, and no one even commented about the can of paint they'd flown through. Didn't make me want to be a pilot. I've been pretty lucky in my short piloting career, only around 60 hours as of right now, and I'm still in training. The scariest thing I've seen is a bald eagle about 8 feet from my left wingtip. It was only 8 feet from the wingtip because me and my instructor dove and rolled the plane as soon as possible. Those large birds are a serious hazard to small aircraft. I was in a Cessna 172s. Be careful of your animal pilots. Bush pilot here. Loaded an aircraft with a 200 kilograms dead wild boar once. Climbed to cruising altitude and the thing starts squealing and unraveling from its straps. Its head was poking out of the bag. Looked right at me and went apeshit. Never been so scared in my life. No autopilot while flying in cloud and only had a screwdriver for self-defense. Air traffic control couldn't hear me beyond the squealing, so they wouldn't let me into their airspace. So I just found some random strip and landed there. The villagers still think I owe them a pig. Flying a Cessna 172 with my instructor out toward Blythe on the way to San Diego hangar when a sandstorm blew up underneath us. I swear the sand was so close it was causing the landing gear tires to spin. This was on a 3-leg check flight. We had landed at Big Bear, California for fuel, and a hot low pressure system moved in pretty quick. It was moving in as we were getting there, like really hot 120 degrees or so, and the air was already really thin. A kid in his solo was taking off, and he got her up off the end of the runway and he just fell out of the sky and crashed. Air was too thin because of the heat and he ran out of runway because he couldn't get up to speed and just pulled up instead of listening to tower, and aborting point crashed and died. Not a pilot, but a skydiver. We called to clear the airspace over the airport for a jump and then made our jump run. I was in free fall when I saw a small plus below me and then it rapidly grew larger. I quickly realized a student pilot out of a nearby flight school didn't know enough to clear the airspace, and I flew past his wing at terminal velocity. Just a small difference and I would have ripped right through that little Cessna. I landed without incident, but I'm certain the pilot never even knew how close he came to death that day. My father was a commercial pilot for over 35 years and has been flying for over 45. He has all kinds of wild stories which range from searching for debris after the Challenger disaster to the mayhem he endured as a pilot during the 9/11 attacks and even towing banners at the Jersey Shore. But the craziest story I've asked him to retell a million times took place off the coast of NSW in Australia in the late 1970s. His plane and crew were in a traffic pattern and were delayed landing because there was quite literally an unidentified flying object on the radar that the tower was tracking. For a while they just circled around in this pattern waiting for other planes to land before they could enter the landing pattern, and lo and behold, the crew eventually got a direction of where this thing was, and when they looked out their windows they could see a cigar-shaped craft moving very slowly at about their same altitude. Upon seeing this, all of the crew and passengers who could see it audibly gasped, and my dad says that was the most disturbing part. Anyway, eventually it went off scope, and they got the all clear to land and nothing more came of it, but it was always my favorite story as a kid to hear from my pops. On my first solo cross country, so my third time ever alone in an airplane, and cross-country flights refer just to a flight from one airport to another, not like all the way across the country. The conditions were pretty good when I took off, and at the surface they were good, but a little higher up the forecasted thunderstorms started developing a little earlier than forecasted. The whole way out there it was good. Some big clouds for sure, and plenty of thermals given how turbulent it was, but none of that is very notable for an August afternoon. By the time I had landed, taxied back, departed, and started on my way home, they had definitely started to at least get pretty tall. I ended up flying under what was most likely a developing thunderstorm on my third solo. It was well clear in terms of cloud clearance, and it wasn't more developed than some big grey clouds, but there wasn't really a good way around it, since there was quite a lot of development in the area, and going around would have resulted in a fairly significant deviation from my flight plan, which obviously made me nervous on my first solo flight navigating. Everything worked out obviously, and I'm nearly to my private pilot's license now, but that was some added stress to an already stressful flight. Also came within probably 30 feet of one bald eagle, and 50 of another soaring together at 3,500 feet. On one hand it is pretty awesome to see such a cool creature way up there doing its thing. On the other, a huge bird like that vs my little Piper Warrior wouldn't have ended well for anyone involved. Funny enough, that was actually on one of my preparation flights for my solo XC, so I guess that was just an exciting route. I'm glad I don't have any really exciting stories yet though. Given how little flying time I have, I would be really unlucky if I did lol. It is to my shame that I admit I nearly had a VFR into IMC, inadvertent flight into IMC, instrument meteorological conditions, from VMC, visual meteorological conditions, is the accident cause with the highest fatality rate in general aviation, and is deadly for all pilots, even those who are instrument rated. So I decide to fly in less than ideal weather as a new private pilot, but the could base is above circuit altitude, so I decide to fly, and back quote have a look. It was just meant to be a sightseeing flight, and there was no mission, and I would return if things didn't look too good. Taxiing out, clouds get darker, and it visibly gets darker in the aircraft. A little C-150, I convince myself that I'm just imagining it, and decide to take off. Lining up, small spots of rain start appearing on the windscreen. On takeoff roll, rain starts coming down pretty heavily. Climbing out, and visibility greatly reduced. Do a very bad circuit to land again, and everything was fine, but never had my hands shaken so much on the yoke. I'll also add that in general aviation, you should plan no time critical mission that can't also be achieved with a car. VFR into IMC accidents are usually caused by pushing on into bad weather when you should turn around, go home, get your car and drive to your destination. Further to this, my instructor always told me takeoffs are optional, but landings are mandatory, and you can cancel a flight right up to takeoff speed, runway length and performance permitting of course, but generally runways are long enough allow small GAD aircraft to accelerate to rotation speed and stop again. Obligatory Blackbird story. Major Brian Shull. Shull was the first pilot to write a book about flying the SR-71. This story comes from his book Sled Driver, Flying the World's Fastest Jet, first published in 1991, now in its 6th printing. Walter and I had just completed the 100 hours required to attain mission-ready status in the jet, ripping across the Arizona deserts 80,000 feet below us. I could already see the coast of California. I was beginning to feel a bit sorry for Walter in the backseat. There he was, with no really good view of the incredible sights before us, tasked with monitoring 4 different radios. The predominant radio chatter was from Los Angeles Center, controlling daily traffic in their sector, while they had us on their scope, albeit briefly. We were in uncontrolled airspace and normally would not talk to them, unless we needed to descend into their airspace. We listened as the shaky voice of a lone Cessna pilot asked Center for a readout of his ground speed. Center replied, November Charlie 175. I'm showing you at 90 knots on the ground. Now the thing to understand about center controllers was that, whether they were talking to a rookie pilot in a Cessna or to Air Force One, they always spoke in the exact same, calm, deep, professional tone that made one feel important. I referred to it as the Houston center voice. Conversely, over the years, pilots always wanted to ensure that, when transmitting, They sounded like Chuck Yeager, or at least like John Wayne. Better to die than sound bad on the radios. Just moments after the Cessna's inquiry, a twin Beech piped up on frequency, in a rather superior tone, asking for his ground speed. I have you at 125 knots of ground speed. Boy, I thought, the Beechcraft really must think he is dazzling his Cessna brethren. Then out of the blue, a Navy F/A-18 pilot out of Naval Air Station Lemoore came up on frequency. You knew right away it was a Navy jock, because he sounded very cool on the radios. Center, Dusty 52 ground speed check. Before Center could reply, I'm thinking to myself, hey, Dusty 52 has a ground speed indicator in that $1 million cockpit, so why is he asking Center for a readout? Then I got it. Old Dusty here is making sure that every bug smasher from Mount Whitney to the Mojave knows what true speed is. He's the fastest dude in the valley today, and he just wants everyone to know how much fun he is having in his new Hornet. And the reply, always with that same calm voice, with more distinct alliteration than emotion. Dusty 52, Center, we have you at 620 on the ground. And I thought to myself, is this a ripe situation? Or what? As my hand instinctively reached for the mic button, I had to remind myself that Walt was in control of the radios. Still, I thought, it must be done. That Hornet must die, and I now. Then I heard it, the click of the mic button from the back seat. That was the very moment that I knew Walter and I had become a crew, very professionally. Walter spoke, Los Angeles Center, Aspen 20, can you give us a ground speed check? There was no hesitation. Aspen 20, I show you at 1842 knots, across the ground. I think it was the 42 knots that I liked the best. So accurate and proud was Center to deliver that information without hesitation. And you just knew he was smiling. Walt keyed the mic once again to say, in his most fighter pilot-like voice, Center, much thanks. We are showing closer to 1900 on the money. For a moment, Walter was a god, and we finally heard a little crack in the armor of the Houston Center voice when LA came back with Roger that Aspen, your equipment is probably more accurate than ours. You boys have a good one. It all had lasted for just moments, but in that short, memorable sprint across the Southwest, the Navy had been flamed. All mortal airplanes on frequency were forced to bow before the king of speed, and more importantly, Walter and I had crossed the threshold of being a crew. A fine day's work. We never heard another transmission on that frequency all the way to the coast.